Alright, so for those of you who grew up largely without network television, or who were lucky enough to watch cable growing up instead of watching what we colloquially refer to as peasant vision and broadcast television like I did, you may not be familiar with Heritage Minutes. If you're not, take a look at some of them online. They're all available on YouTube. You can take a look at them and that's fine. Structurally, these are 1-minute films that are made by an organization called Historica Canada. It's a history foundation. They also make the Canadian Encyclopedia, which is a great source to know about for figuring out your facts to add to our discussion board posts. That's available to you. When we talk about Heritage Minutes, they are 1-minute films that are largely about about Canada's history, moments, people, events, that kind of thing. And for a really long time, these were shown on television to meet Canadian content regulations. We'll talk about Canadian content when we get to the CBC later on. That's fine. But they're designed to sort of allow people to do that. But that also means that for a lot of Canadians, this is their exposure to Canadian history. This is the only time they've ever heard anyone talk about Canadian history outside of, say, a social studies classroom. And that makes them really, really important to understand when we start talking about Canadian history. There's a couple of things you need to understand about that, sort of to set up this assignment. The first thing is, and we'll get to this when we sort of start talking about our own contextualization of historical events and how that is important and what comes before and what comes after, it's really hard to get anything important down into a minute. Which means that in order to do that, you have to make some choices about what's important to tell in this story and what's not. And when we talk about identity in general, and especially national identity, right, a lot of this class is sort of really fundamentally about what it means to be Canadian, which is a national identity question. When we talk about that sort of thing, an important piece to recognize is that identities are not objects that exist out in the world. They're things we build. And so the example that I usually give in terms of this to help students understand this is to think about your most recent romantic ex or one of your friends or whatnot like that, and think about how they would tell the story of the breakup and how you would. And recognize that you're talking about the same event. You're just telling two different stories, right? If your most recent romantic partner broke up with you, then when you tell the story, you're telling the story about being wronged and hurt by this heartless person. But if they tell the story, they're telling a different one. They don't sit down and say, so I set out to hurt this person. They sit down and say, you know what, our lives are going in different directions. They sit down and say, I needed to get out of a relationship that wasn't supportive or good for me in this way. All of those things are really, really important. And we understand that when we talk about sort of how people talk about their lives, but it's also really important to understand that we do that at a national level too. We make decisions about what we say and don't say about Canada, and those decisions are really important in terms of how Canadians and people around the world think about Canada. What do we think is actually happening in this country? And your Heritage Minute assignment is really asking you to dig into that question about, we took this event that happened or this person that existed, right? We're not talking about making things up. We're talking about a very specific person or event that sort of occurred in this moment. And we're choosing to make it important enough to be one of the 84, I think they might be up to 86 now, like 86 minutes. If you're covering all of Canadian history in 86 minutes, this is the minute, this thing gets 1 minute. Why? And you're sort of so the assignment, and you'll sort of see the details of this, but your assignment is really talking about that piece, about that question of, why was this important enough? And there's a couple of things you need to know about that. First, there are a lot of different answers to that for every one of the Heritage Minutes. That's not a problem. Don't worry about choosing the correct answer for that, because I'm way more interested in your analysis than in you finding a specific answer that I've already decided on. The other thing is that those are choices. So, as I said, the Historica Canada Foundation makes these Heritage Minutes, and when they do so, they are choosing things to tell particular stories about Canada. They're trying to say something in particular. That might be a story about Canadians as a population. That might be a story about Canada's military history, Canada's sports history, any number of different things, Canada's capacity to innovate, our medical field, our political system. There's a lot of things that sort of go on there. That can be a message about Canadian values, all kinds of different things. And these selections are chosen to do that. And so the first part of that assignment, after you chose a Heritage Minute, is with your group to talk about what story this video is trying to say about Canada. And one of the places students often get tripped up with this is they sort of go, here's this person, why should Canadians care about this person? And they give me their answer about why Canadians should care about this person. And when I write the evaluations, I write back that the point of this was to figure out why Historica Canada thought that this was an important enough thing to talk about. So what you're looking for is the message that this video is trying to give us about Canada. Why is this person, why is this event important enough to get one of less than 90 minutes of our entire country's history? Okay. That's the first sort of chunk of that analysis. The second chunk of the analysis is to sort of think about, what do you have to leave out to tell that story, right? So, for example, we're talking about colonization for the next couple of weeks. And if we talk about something like colonization, we can tell the colonization of Canada as sort of the story of intrepid explorers going out to conquer this sort of wild and unforgiving land that's really cold, there's a lot of conflicts with nature, and that we can talk about colonization as the story of subduing and civilizing the land. We can tell that story. That is a way of talking about the story about colonization, and it's actually one that Europeans told for a really, really, really long time. However, in order to tell that story, okay, and in order to make that narrative simple in that way, you kind of have to leave out that there were already people here, and that those people had different ways of relating to the land and different ways of understanding the land, and that when we talk about those intrepid explorers coming across the mountain ranges, most of them actually had guides of people who lived there and knew where they were going. And to sort of follow along an experienced guide as you go through a trek is not quite the same thing. It doesn't say the same thing about a person than sort of walking into uncharted territory. And that doesn't mean that either of those stories is wrong, right? There's still something to be said about, I have no idea what's over that mountain range, but I'm going to trust this person that I met 3 months ago, and I'm going to follow them. It's not that person didn't require a certain kind of bravery. It's that bravery is only part of the story. And if you want to talk about Canadians as brave and intrepid, then you focus on that piece of the story, and you wind up minimizing the effect of, for example, in this case anyway, a large number of Indigenous guides who were willing to share their expertise and their understanding of Canada with settlers. Okay? So the second part of your assignment is about that piece. You're looking for, what did we leave out in order to be able to tell the story we want to tell with this minute? And when you do that, this is sort of very clear in the sort of preparation exercise, which is up in our discussion boards for this week, but when you do that, what you're looking for is the ability to sort of talk about things that matter, okay? If I talk about, one band of explorers crossing a particular part of the country, yeah, I left out their other 4 expeditions or the other 3 expeditions that go to different areas, but that may not change the story, right? If I have 15 parties of explorers that are going off to explore unmapped visions of Canada, telling only one of them doesn't actually challenge the narrative. Saying, oh, they were just following directions from the Indigenous populations to get to a spot that they already knew existed, that does challenge the narrative, if that makes some sense. So when you do that, you're looking for those sort of pieces. We'll talk about this a little bit. Again, the discussion forums are available for this. You can ask questions. There's a simulated version, a scaffolded version of this in our discussion boards for this week, so you can take a look at that. But you're trying to create that sort of cohesive story. When you do that, and with your group, you are responsible for communicating that in 2 ways. The first is a short paper, 3.5 pages, A word about page length in my class. They're largely suggestions. If you need an extra page, take it. If you don't worry about it. I'm just sort of trying to give you an idea of how long I think it will take you to do the work that I'm asking you to do. So if I tell you that you need 3.5 pages, you probably don't want to be writing a paragraph because you won't be getting the analysis in that I want you to have. Likewise, you're probably doing too much if your paper is 15 pages long. I will read it, I will grade it, you just probably did more work than you needed to do. Okay, so you've got a paper to put together and then you have a presentation. And normally I do these as 10-minute presentations in class, but we're not doing that this semester. So what you need to do is figure out a way of communicating that analysis to your peers in some way that is engaging. And other than that, I'm pretty open to whatever you want to do, so long as you provide a link to the Heritage Minute you're working with. So if you want to make a video, go ahead and make a video. If you want to record a podcast, go ahead and do that. If you want to do a PowerPoint slide and record some audio, you can do that too. If you want to work with Prezi, if you want to work with Adobe Spark, you can do whatever you need to do to communicate that. Work with your groups, do what you're comfortable with, do what fits your presentation analysis. Like, I'm not assessing your technical capacity here. I've had students do this presentation online entirely in text. They wrote some really, really lovely sort of prompts and almost like a choose your own adventure kind of thing that worked for their presentation. You can do that kind of thing. Like, this is not a technical capacity question. The question is, and what I'm evaluating in that is twofold. One, about whether you're communicating your analysis of the Heritage Minute. If you're giving your peers something that they can't get just by watching the Heritage Minute, right? And then the other piece that I'm looking for there is some kind of engagement. So I imagine that none of you are really would be super excited to read a 5 or 6 page paper that someone posted talking about their presentation as their presentation, so you probably shouldn't post it. You're looking for something that can be engaging and can sort of connect with your peers in a way that's meaningful and important. I'm not sort of, as I said, interested in the technical aspect. I'm interested in the communication aspect. So this is not a statement that you need to have super slick technology skills. That's not. I mean, you'll notice I'm recording on my laptop, and it's really just a talking head. So you can do that if you're comfortable with that, and if not, you can do any number of other things. And then the last part of that is to ask a discussion question in that presentation to sort of stimulate some discussion among your peers about the topic of your presentation. There's some more guidelines about that in the Heritage Minute assignment guidelines, which you should take a look at this week before you complete the sort of scaffolded version. And then the last piece of this assignment is pretty simple. It's just because all of you are working in groups for this assignment. Don't ask me if you can work alone, because the answer will be no. Because you're working in groups, I don't know what's happening in your group. I don't know if one person is doing all the work, if someone else is doing absolutely nothing. So I'm going to ask you to write evaluations of your contribution to the group and your classmates' contributions to the group. There's some guidelines for that, but I want you to write sort of that, mostly so that I know and I can sort of adjust scores if someone did absolutely nothing, for example. Ideally, if someone's doing nothing, you should tell me beforehand, because sometimes we can fix the problem before it becomes an issue. The last part of that is that I want you to write a reflection about what you learned about Canada and Canadian identity doing this assignment. Again, pretty open-ended. You can write kind of sort of what you need, but I do want you to think about that. I want you to think about what this process of doing a project like this teaches you. That's about all I have to say about that Heritage Minute assignment. You are more than welcome to ask me any questions you have. There's a forum set up for that already on the discussion boards, and I do check them relatively regularly, so if you have a question, I am happy to answer it. And other than that, I will see you when I next record videos for early French colonization.